I'm going to hop right into a few jobs here. The schedule's kind of mixed up from losing a day and a half last week. And for some reason, I've fallen into one of those crevasses where it's exactly the same job over and over and over and over and over. Kind of a Groundhog Day situation where every morning I'm waking up and I'm looking at a bridge that has become partially lifted from the top. And I've shown how I handle this quite a lot in the last month or two, so in an effort to not become boring, maybe I'll pull a few tidbits from a number of these and string them together. This is a pretty recent Guild 12 string, one of their Chinese offerings. Big body. The bridge came off reasonably well. It did leave behind this kind of dirty looking residue, which leads me to suspect that maybe it was dyed. Anyway, this might be a useful illustration of how I deal with a specific problem. I'm not sure how long the bridge was lifting. It was up a good 1/16 of an inch or so, 1.6 millimeters, and the strings were at or near full tension when I got it. I've mentioned this a time or two, but if you notice the bridge is lifting on your guitar more than, say, the thickness of a business card, you want to take the tension off the strings, because if you leave it, there's the chance the bridge will hold on to that slightly kinked aspect and not return to flatness when you're done. So I pulled this off last night and I clamped it flat while it was still warm from the heater. But I'm willing to bet that it's still going to be bent, and bent enough that it will be under more tension than I feel is safe after I've clamped it to the body, so that it might open up again. Yeah. That's not good. It's certainly more than I could sand out off the bottom. So what I'm going to do is try and bend it in the opposite direction. I've got to heat this up and clamp it into that reverse bend. So when it comes time to glue this back down, all of the edges will touch first, sort of preloaded against the tendency to lift, especially at the back here. Here you can get a better look at what's going on. So it would take an awful lot of clamping pressure to push this down to the soundboard, and that tension is going to remain on it with the addition of string tension, so it's not good. Looking at the underside of the bridge here, there's sort of an interesting phenomenon going on. You can see the striations from grain lines in the spruce of the soundboard, which is exactly opposite, because there's missing material here. Some of the underside of the bridge was left on the top rather than the other way around. Fascinating. It's also quite dark in color versus the top. I mean, this looks like standard, very flat sawn Indian rosewood, which could also be part of the reason it cupped. In the flat sawn material, if the top surface dried out, it can contract and it sort of pulls away the edges and up into this convex configuration. This is why I like using quarter sawn material for bridges rather than flat sawn. It's just more dimensionally stable. A quarter sawn bridge will shrink, but it shrinks dimensionally fairly equal between across the grain and in thickness. It's sort of a judgment call. I've got to be a bit careful because there are a lot of holes here, and I don't really want to split it through those, so I'm going to use this piece of veneer. This is a fairly thick piece of veneer. It's a 32nd of an inch, which is about 0.8 millimeters. And it's curved, so it's going to affect both the wings and the belly back here. Sort of focusing most of the tension kind of along the midline, so we're going to end up with a concave shape if you look at the bottom of the bridge. Just going to sand and relieve that sharp corner. This is my silicone heat blanket for bending sides. I'll just make a nice little sandwich of that. Let it get warm. By warm, I mean 270 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 130 Celsius. So yeah, fast movements keep the fingertips from burning. I have to get this clamped up pretty quickly, which is a bit of a chore because it takes a lot of clamps. Really want to support it from both sides. Okay, left it in clamps for a few hours. It's much flatter than it was. Still not perfect, but I can work with it, you know. This whole removing the finish from under the bridge is one way in which guitars definitely aren't as good as they used to be. Do you call it lazy? I don't know, but it's the one thing that even some really decent manufacturers are getting wrong these days. You know, I heard a manufacturer say, "Oh, it's a modern and completely acceptable way of doing things," and well, why have I done 7 of these so far this month? Not that I'm complaining. I think the black is actually epoxy. It's got a coloring in it. You see this black line here? My score line is about 1/2 millimeter outside it. And what this represents is another situation I've talked about before, where if you're going to score around the bridge, you have to be really careful not to go below the surface of the lacquer. If you cut into the wood and the bridge starts to lift, it will take a chunk of the top wood with it. It acts like a starting point for the bridge to loosen. That's what's happened down here. You can see these broken fibers. So, yeah. Basically, I have to kind of scrape down to below the level of the score line, which is not ideal, but it's the safest thing to do. You can see it better from this side with raking light. There's always one side of the top. The grain is in opposite directions due to run out, which is a concept I'm not going to get into here. But basically think of it as hair on a dog's back going this way in this direction and this way on the other direction. So you can see how these fibers here separated along the edge. Lift it up and let the bridge go free. This is self-adhesive sandpaper, which removes material, but it also serves to mark where it's coming off so I can be more efficient and use a scraper. Take off more at a time. I get that glued in place, clean up all the squeeze out, let it dry for at least a day. The owner has asked me to set this up as semitone low, so it's in E flat, which I think is a good thing. To my mind, in my ear, most 12 strings actually sound better in a place that's not standard tuning. I think D, E flat, even C sharp, I mean, that's the home of the 12-string guitar. Maybe I listened to too much Lead Belly as a kid. The action is a little bit high, especially on the bass strings. However, the relief in the neck is actually astronomical. So let's see what kind of truss rod this has in it. The 4 millimeter. So I'm going to give this a generous turn to begin with. I fixed the relief, which lowered the action, and revealed the not uncommon occurrence of some high frets around the neck to body joint. So I leveled those, recrowned them. When working with 12 strings, you learn not to loosen all the strings unless you absolutely have to. Polishing, you know the deal. We'll play it. I like this guitar. It's a big sounding 12 string. Well now, let's do that all over again with the Gibson Southern Jumbo. This one is from 1967. The owner said he thought someone told him it was a 69, but I looked up the serial number. It is a 67, which is good in this case for a number of reasons. The SJ is basically a deluxe version of the J45. Rather than the simple dot inlays on the fingerboard, they gave it the fancy split parallelograms. And it's got a few extra purfling lines around the body. It's also got these squared off shoulders that you would see on a hummingbird. In 1967, this thing cost $265, where the J45 and its non-sunburst brother the J50. They actually cost the same at that point, $45 less. So that's a considerable difference. These are nicely made and pretty desirable. Things changed in 1969, late 68 into 69. They went to the double X brace, which is, I've shown that one before. It has kind of a diamond effect pattern, 2 X braces overlaid on top of each other, which, you know, it's a much heavier bracing scheme. People think it's kind of not so great, and sometimes they're right. It just became really heavy. A different guitar. It also had a longer scale at that point. They went from 24 3/4 up to 25 1/2. So they feel different to play as well. So this is a family treasure. We're going to put it into good shape and make it playable. There is, again, some separation from the soundboard at the ends of the wings of the bridge. Surprisingly not in the center, which is where you usually expect it. But both ends are a little loose. Not catastrophically. There's also a crack that's running through the bridge pin holes all the way across there, which is of real concern. We do have to take care of that. Now, like most of the Gibsons from this period, this has both the screw adjustable saddle, and there are a couple of bolts that run through the bridge and the top itself, holding it in place. They're hidden underneath these pearl dots. From what I can see, this has probably never been messed with. It's likely still got the original factory setup. Now the action is high, and the relief is a bit much. But look at the saddle. It's sticking up really nice and tall above the bridge, so there should be room for it to come down. I get the feeling this guitar spent a lot of time in the case. It's clean in areas where usually dust collects. And it doesn't look like it's been overly cleaned either. Pretty clean truss rod. Yeah, you can hear that? That crunchy sound? Yeah, I don't think anyone has ever adjusted this. That was lacquer that was on there, which I just broke through. People get upset at that. It's like being proud that your 1967 Chevelle never had an oil change. I put a little bit of grease on the threads just to lubricate them. The relief started off around 16 thousandths. We're now down to about 9, and the action has come down a full 64th of an inch. So we're now 8/64ths on the bass side, 5 1/2 on the treble, which is getting into the range of playability. Pretty remarkable actually for a 55-year-old guitar. Okay, I'm just going to bottom this out as far as it'll go and see what that gives us. So we're looking at 7/64ths on the bass, probably 5 on the treble. Okay. With it bottomed out, we've still got good break angle for the strings, so I bet you I can take a sliver off the bottom of this saddle and get us a little bit lower. A lot depends on how these pins feel as they come out. If they're still good and snug, I might just glue this thing up in place. Yeah, they're tight. Given that the main body of the bridge is still perfectly tight, it's just a little spot on each end that's loose. And the crack itself through the bridge pin holes doesn't go all the way down to the top. It kind of kicks off at an angle into the bridge following the grain line. It's not perfectly quarter sawn, it's sort of at an angle or rift sawn. Probably difficult to close really tightly. Yeah, this is kind of where it wants to be, and the pins are still very tight in their holes. It's not like they're flopping around and loose. The holes have taken on a kind of oblong aspect, but yeah, I think it's probably best for me to, this is going to sound self-contradictory, but I'm just going to glue this right down without taking the bridge off. I can clean it out with some sandpaper, and I'm going to fill this crack here and sort of leave it as it is, because it's kind of the resting place for this bridge after 50 years of movement back and forth, this is where it wants to be. So rather than forcing it into a shape that it doesn't really want to be in, it's probably better just to fill this. These screws are, of course, ridiculously long for their job. You can see there are some brass inserts directly in the soundboard there, which are tapped to receive these screws, and these have a landing that's machined on them, which is sized to fit the end of the saddle. So if I want to remove any height on this, to take down the action, or plane something off the bottom, I have to replace it on the top of the saddle, or in other words, this gets really sloppy, and this starts to protrude way up above the bridge, which doesn't look good. So if I take a 64th off, I'll put a 64th on, basically. Sanding just involves a couple of strokes with 150 grit paper. And then to do the soundboard, I mask off around the bridge so I'm not scratching the finish. I'll blow it out with some compressed air. So I glued the wings back down. Didn't take too much clamping pressure, and then cleaned up. Okay, the wings are now fully stuck down. I can turn my attention to the crack. Examining it, there is a section that runs off into the treble side wing here, which I definitely want to get glue in. But on the whole, this thing is not in danger of falling apart. The crack likely started due to shrinking stresses against the bolts that run through the bridge, but this is very firm. Almost impossible to shift. You couldn't clamp it closed. As I've mentioned before, Brazilian is a wood that just loves to crack. Filling the cracks involves charging them with thin CA glue, adding a scoop of wood dust. This happens to be a different kind of rosewood, but it'll function well. Pack that into the crack as well as possible. Then adding more dust, then more glue, then more dust. Probably 5 or 6 applications before it's level with the surface, and I overfill slightly. While the glue gets hard, I'll lower the saddle. I'm setting my marking gauge for 1/32 of an inch, which is about 0.3 millimeters. Then I'll scribe a line on it and plane down to that line. I planed and cut some filler pieces and glued them on the top and pared off the excess carefully. Then I had to drill the hole for the post. Pretty clean installation. Looks good. I do the initial leveling of the glue dust matrix, because it's like about half and half, with a file, as it keeps things flatter and doesn't abrade the surrounding wood faster than the glue areas. Then some sanding, a little bit of oil. I'll clean up the pinholes, enlarging them a little bit so they're not quite so tight a fit. That might have been the other reason, or another cause for the crack. Pins that are too tight. This one is a real disappearing act. You wouldn't know if you didn't know. It's another one of the narrow neck Gibsons. The string spacing is not too bad on this one. I can play it. Pretty happy with it. It's got that British Invasion acoustic sound. Beatles, Stones, that kind of thing. Kind of clicky from the metal in the bridge, and also slightly soft from the rosewood saddle. It's a very distinctive 60s tone. Now let's do it all over again on a Walden Natura. I'm kidding. I'm not going to subject you to another one. Have a good week.